everybody.
We are home.
We're home at last. Did you stay with us? Did you remember us? Did you forget us? Will we ever really know? There's always the lag when we first come on and we can't see you yet.
Yeah.
So we don't know if you exist. And this is, of course, our new time as chosen by y'all in our poll that we did a couple of months ago. And so we're going to see how we go. UK, see, here we go. Rachel, first one up is UK. Because you're not sleeping yet.
Boom. Julianne says, welcome home. Thank you, darling. Welcome back to the gathering room.
Wendy from Guelph is now Wendy from Blue Mountain.
What?
The artist formerly known as Wendy from Guelph.
Oh, my gosh. This has some Dante implication, I feel.
Sure it does.
Those Guelphs.
Hi, Donna. Oh, you guys remembered us.
Donna and Jessica and Janet and Karen and everybody. Marianne's here. Catherine's here.
Is home from.
Hi, Sonia.
Home from Africa.
We all home from Africa.
Hi, all you lovelies.
Allison and Casey and everybody.
Hi, River.
Rose. And Trisha. Hi, Trisha, darling. Nancy and Anne-Marie.
All our friends are here.
So
all
good.
Gathering.
This was the whole point. This was the entire reason for this.
Hi, Stephen. Lovely to see you.
A gentleman.
Yeah.
Oh. Eugenia and Michelle
Hey,
and Alexa.
Hi, Pam. Oh, our Africa peeps are here.
Africa peeps.
We're so lucky.
Plus Joanne and Joyce and Kristen and Maria.
So many.
Electa and Rhonda and Christina and Kathleen. Oh, we're over 100. That means it is time for you to announce an announcement.
I believe the announcement has already been announced, but this is Martha Beck.
Yes.
You are on the gathering room. Handling uncertainty.
Badger.
Handling uncertainty.
Rowan Mangan.
Handling uncertainty.
Handling uncertainty. Okay.
Handling uncertainty.
All right. So I just got back from Africa and we had the most wonderful time. Some of you were there with us and it was so, as it always is, it's like going into the Garden of Eden and seeing the way the earth might look again and certainly looked 70,000 years ago and thinking, woo, hope. And interacting very, very closely with wild creatures. And it's odd coming from our insulated, civilized world and going into a very wild landscape because the basic uncertainty of life is so very highlighted when you're out there in the wild. You see like an antelope that has a brand new baby and you think, oh, that little baby is so cute. I bet she's so happy. Oh, I hope it lives through the night because that baby looks a little bit like live bait to a lot of the creatures out here. So then I will speak for myself. I can get very verklempt. Then you start following a pride of lions and for a couple of days you see their bellies shrink and the cubs aren't getting any food and you're like, I hope they kill something soon because if they don't, this will not go well. Then you think, oh, back to the antelope. I hope that doesn't get killed. Then back to the lions. I hope they kill something. And then you see them eating a hippo and you're like, gotta eat. Hippo is going to die someday anyway. And you start to get kind of sanguine about the basic uncertainty of life if you're there for long enough. And it made me think deeply about the issue of handling uncertainty in our own lives. And when we come back to the US, to the first world, everything seems so managed and is so managed. I mean, the unpredictabilities that we face compared to the unpredictabilities of the wild or of most life in the third world for humans, check our privilege, please. Our level of certainty is very high for basic things like having enough food, enough water, enough shelter. By the way, speaking of water, this is from the plane. I use glass bottles. Sorry, Mother Earth, I'm reusing and recycling. Okay, so on the plane home, I was thinking a lot about going into a world where we think we're certain and where uncertainty is always the sort of rumble underneath our consciousness. I went to a fabulous movie yesterday, late night, loved it. Emma Thompson, Mindy Kaling, amazing. There's a character in there that has Parkinson's disease. And just that little thing perked up in me. Ooh, whoa, it could happen to anybody. And the older you get, the more precarious things become. And you see little things. You see a car accident, that's just a moment of drowsiness, and I'm very jet lagged. So it was very self-centered introspection, but at least I was looking at the fact of uncertainty, and I started to think about how difficult it was for me when I first realized that the world was essentially uncertain. I think it was when I saw a cat get killed by a car when I was little, and I was hysterical. I was inconsolable. I looked at this dead cat and just lost it and didn't recover for about, 40 years or something. But then I started doing a lot of spiritual practice and a lot of self-help, and I did find ways to cope with uncertainty better. So I have written down a couple of the ways that most of us deal with it, and then some other ways that I have learned may work better. So in our culture, the first thing is just to assume that we pretty much know what to expect. For example, I thought, we know the sun's going to rise tomorrow. We know that. Like, that is a dead certainty. But then I thought about the year 535 AD when I was just a girl. In that year, the summer came and it didn't come. They think there must have been a vast volcanic explosion somewhere in the tropics, and the dust blanketed the entire atmosphere of the Earth in a thick, hazy coating that didn't allow much warmth or light through. So in the year 535, there was worldwide massive famine, and nobody knew anything about what was happening. So they were all just like wondering why the sun hadn't come up ever for a summer, and dying. And yeah, we can't really assume anything. It's not like we can control volcanoes just because we now know more about them. We can't control them. There are also things that happen unpredictably that are really good. I was reading, I have to confess, my thoughts about uncertainty were greatly enhanced because I was reading this beautiful book, In Love with the World, by Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, a Tibetan monk. And it's a story of his near-death experience. And I'm a fool for a near-death experience. And in this case, because he was a Tibetan monk, and Tibetan monks literally study all their lives for the experience of death so that they can remain very conscious during the dying process. So he went off by himself to do a meditation retreat, and he got really sick, and he lay on the ground, very, very, very sick, no water, no food for days at a time. And then he started to die. And he went through, he managed to remain alert and meditative through all these stages of his body shutting down, his kidneys shutting down, his lungs shutting down, his heart shutting, everything shutting down. And he had this unbelievably beautiful experience once he could get past the fear of the uncertainty of what would happen. But just when he was getting used to being dead, some guy came and found his body and scraped him up and took him to a hospital. And in some interesting spiritual way, he made the decision to come back, but he had no ability to predict that a stranger would come and pick him up and take him to the hospital. So sometimes things we would call good, like redemption or rescue, can happen unexpectedly. So we assume something good will happen, maybe not. We assume something bad will happen, maybe not. We just don't know. Another way we try to be certain is to just insist that things are going to work the way we want them to. You will love me, and we will stop teenagers from having sex by admonishing them sternly. That's working. Yeah, like so many attempts to control the world, and none of it ever really takes, right? The final way we can try to be certain is to actually stop living. When we finally acknowledge, oh, living is essentially uncertain. Living and dying, well, they say the time of death is unknown. The fact of death is certain. So then what will you do now? That's another Buddhist saying, good point. Well, one thing you can do is shut it all down, become agoraphobic, go into your house, only stay in the areas you feel safe, and wait for death. Kind of worked for Emily Dickinson. I'm not judging. I'm just saying, might as well get out. I mean, if you can't really control death, whether you're in a controlled circumstance or not, you still have a heart attack. So, because she could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for Emily, even though she stayed in the house. And then the other way, of course, is to actually kill yourself. But as Hamlet, as Shakespeare so movingly pointed out, we don't even know that. We're in that sleep of death. What dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, and so on and so on. Weakens the will and makes us rather, what is it? Choose these ills we have, then fly to others that we know not of. Choose those ills we have, then fly to others that we know not of. We don't know what's going to happen when we die, so even that isn't going to control anything. So you might as well face it. And that actually is the other way of coping with uncertainty. And it's a very Asian way. The Western way of coping with uncertainty is to try to deny it by whatever means. The Eastern way, philosophically at least, I don't know about every Eastern person, but Eastern philosophical traditions deliberately turn us toward the fact of basic uncertainty and impermanence as being exactly what the world is made of. Mingyur Rinpoche writes about how in Tibet, when a child does something silly, the parents say, "Why are you doing that? Remember death and uncertainty. Remember death and impermanence, and consider what you're doing with your actions." And I thought, well, that's a little stressful for the kids. But what they mean is that by being really aware that life is limited and fleeting and that we are uncertain, remembering that until and sitting with it until we're okay with it, puts us in a place of increased wisdom. And that is something, that's exactly what I want to suggest for you today. So first thing you do is you sit down and you notice that you have no control over what's happening, what's going to happen. No, you really don't. You can kind of for a while, but ultimately no. So what's left to do? Notice what happens in you as you face the absoluteness of uncertainty. And what will happen is a huge emotional kick up, anger, sorrow, fear, all the terrible emotions. You watch that. You watch it. Now, you can do this fatalistically and just sort of go like, okay, I have no control, so whatever happens to me, I will take it. I kind of did that for a while after my son was born, and I realized I couldn't control anything, couldn't control his Down syndrome, couldn't control anybody's life. And I just kind of went into a victim place of doing whatever. Things are going to happen to me. I will tolerate it. That's not a very enlightened way of doing it either. But you can contemplate uncertainty in a way that takes you all the way through fatalism into something that is such a deep confidence. It's actually more than optimism. See, if you watch the disturbance enough as you contemplate impermanence and the end of all things, if you do it long enough, if you just watch, it ultimately starts to settle down inside you as acceptable, or at least not particularly exciting in the moment. It goes quiet. It starts to get quieter. And then you notice that there are spaces between the negative emotions, and that those spaces where there's no thought and no emotion either are actually quite interesting. They're quite appealing. There's a stillness to them that gets increasingly fascinating the more you wish to stop being upset. And as the periods of time get where there's a space, get more attention, they stretch. And you start to be able to go into them. And you realize that in the middle of all this eternal change, there is one thing that never ever changes, and that is the space in which it all occurs. There is space suffusing our bodies. There is more space by far, by incredible amounts of space inside every single atom of your body compared to the subatomic particles that make up the atom. It's something like if you put a tennis ball in a football stadium, the football stadium would be the atom, and the tennis ball would be the amount of actual matter in the atom. All the rest of it is space. The same space that holds the planets, the same space that holds us when we're sound asleep, the same space that can creep into our hearts when we're deeply sorrowing and say, it's okay, I'm right here. So not just the Asian, but also the Western philosophical and spiritual traditions talk about the peace that passeth understanding and the absolute stillness of our essential nature. In Buddhism, they call it luminous emptiness, but it contains all things. And in the Bible, there's that beautiful phrase, be still and know that I am God, which Eckhart Tolle says is just the same thing repeated over and over. Be still, know I am God. All words for God. Just God repeated 5 times. And there's something about that phrase, even when I was a child reading scriptures and going, I'm supposed to do this according to my religion, but it's making me very uncomfortable. When I got to the phrase, be still and know that I am God, something in me went, because the I that's speaking is the I that's reading. There is only one being speaking what it is, that it is. And when the being inside of you catches the vastness of the stillness that is, everything rests. And within that absolutely unchanging space, all change occurs. And so none of it is going to be hurtful. It's all ultimately benevolent. If space holds everything and space is love, everything's fine because space never goes away and it never changes. Like the old Christian hymn says, "O thou who changest not, abide with me." So abiding in the changeless is the way to hold your whole life so that uncertainty is just like waves on the sea and you've got a little boat and you know it's going to float. So with that, I'd like to take some questions, something I couldn't do while we were in Africa. So here comes the gracious Badger.
Hello.
Hello.
Since we've been away for a little while, I will just remind you all, please feel free to ask your questions in the comments. If you want to get yours answered, a good tip is keep it short and keep it on topic. There we go. Now I've got one straight off the bat from Donna. How can we help others who are uncertain? I agree, the awareness and being still allows the comfort, but others often spiral. How can we help others?
Well, you be the stillness. You can become very still in your own self, and your nervous system is actually emitting an electromagnetic frequency in all directions that can be measured by instruments at least 10 feet away from your body, or at most 10 feet away from your body, actually, but theoretically it's infinite. And everybody else's brain is also an electromagnetic mechanism that is picking up the wave frequencies of everything around it. So if you're in the room with someone who is very still, your own nervous system becomes very still. When we were in Africa, and the animals are very still because I believe they do abide in that peace, unless they're being chased or chasing. Other than that, they're kind of abiding in peace all the time. So when you're in that, it entrains you to it. And just to cap that off, you can say it. One of my favorite translations of a Hafiz poem, or a bit of a poem by Hafiz, who is a 13th century mystic poet, is very simple. It goes like this: troubled, then stay with me, for I am not. I'm not troubled. I'm right here with you. And that's what that's all God ever says, by the way. Troubled, then stay with me, for I am not.
Christy asks, how can I sustain that stillness and parasympathetic peace?
Practice, 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 practice. There's a reason I call it spiritual practice, but it's like, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, which sounds kind of boring. I don't have to practice. I want to get good at it. But the thing is, all you're doing is focusing your brain at one thing or another. So all day, every day, you're practicing. You're practicing gearing your brain to social media, perhaps, or gearing your brain to your family's mood swings, or gearing your brain to news reports or whatever, you're always directing your attention. You're always in practice. But what are you going to practice? And most people practice trouble, the troubled mind in our culture. Very, very well-intentioned trouble. If we're just aware enough, we can control it and it won't be uncertain, because that always works, except for never. So just start to focus your awareness on the spaces of stillness and notice how much sweeter they are. And then it's like when I finally started meditating for longer periods, it was because the sweetness of those spaces was so intense. I was absolutely magnetically drawn to it. I didn't do it as something rigid or something I had to do. I did it because it was sweet. So practice what feels sweet and watch it grow. It will.
Related, Karen asks, is it a gradual process when you make a transition to releasing control? How long to mastery?
Depends.
17 years.
Depends on which road you want to take. I think at some point I had my hand stamped with the thing that said, I want the relatively quick road. And the angels guarding the gate said, good, we will beat the ever-loving crap out of you and ruin your life. That's the quicker way. We could put you into a genocide, which is the quickest way of all, but no. I once had someone who'd lived through genocide tell me, I said, how the hell did you not lose your mind? And she said, well, when you're up against real horror, you either lose God or you find God. And I found God. And I was like, wow, you got the really good hand stamp that I would never dare take. Or maybe she just lucked into it. I'm not saying it was her choice, but she wrote it out by God. And I've never met a more radiant being. If you want to go the slow route, which most of us in the first world, I think, do, yeah, you gradually intensify and enlarge the amount of attention that you give to the peace that passeth understanding, and it starts to grow in you. It's just like strengthening a muscle, except that I believe it has the power to become infinitely strong, which muscles don't.
Excellent. Lara asks, what about how trauma rewires the brain? How do you unwire the paths that are rutted to trouble?
The very fact that trauma rewires the brain, which I first read that when I was 13, and I was like, I am screwed. I knew my brain was badly wired. But then they went ahead and found out that everything is always being rewired all the time. If we repeat our thoughts that are based on trauma, we deepen the pattern of the trauma. If we break the pattern of the thoughts caused by trauma, we can rewire it into benevolence. And every single brain is rewired by some kind of pain. It doesn't have to be something horrifying. It could be just like having people ignore you, or belonging to an ethnic group that isn't fairly treated. I mean, there can be traumas that don't look like somebody jumping you in an alley, but they still rewire the brain powerfully. And they still cause us to anticipate hurt and then guard against it. It's a way of trying to control uncertainty. Something bad happened to me once, so I'm going to go into a position of always being ready to fight it, control it, or avoid it. That's what the traumatized brain tells us to do. And that's what the culture reinforces. Ways to be safe, ways to avoid, like we can't, and I think we should avoid things that trigger traumatic reactions. But what do you do if you can't avoid them? And they are re-triggered. Then having a practice where you can sit, and the first thing, I'm going to spell it out again, sit still with the panic, sit still with the anger, sit still with it. And yes, you can speak out and march against injustice and do all the things. But at some point, stop and be quiet in the body, or go for a walk and be quiet in the mind, until you start to be able to watch the suffering from a little bit outside. And Mingyur Rinpoche says something so beautiful in his book. He says, once you learn to watch the pain, you are not the same size and shape as your pain. You are bigger. So I can say it with trauma too. Once you can start to watch your traumatized reaction, you are not the size and shape of your trauma. you are bigger. You are, in fact, vast. And your trauma begins to shrink relative to your perception of what you actually are, which is infinite. And that rewires the brain. And they've done tons of research to show that. Yeah.
Okay, Aletta says, sometimes sitting in the stillness feels irresponsible. There is the scared part that wants to act, but the wise inner being says, just wait, when to act.
Wise inner being. You already have a wise inner being connection. Why are you asking me? Ask your wise inner being, because that's the only one that knows. As Nisargadatta says, no teacher can take you all the way to your goal, for the teacher is the goal, the connection to that wise inner being. We do have a culture that says that anything except frantic action and attempts to control reality is laziness and deplorable lack of caring. I think it's commendable lack of caring, lack of being so obsessed with caring about things that we never stop and figure out what to do about them. Because it's like, I'm going to quote Rinpoche again. He says, until we get quiet inside, we are like people, a mob screaming and fighting for peace. You see the irony there. As long as you are screaming and fighting for peace, there will never be peace. So if you get quiet in yourself and then act, number one, the actions you take will not feed into the bad system. Number two, you will be much more powerful from a position of calm. And those of you who came to Africa with me saw that. If you get into a position of deep calm where you're resonating with this very quiet energy of nature, everything you do becomes more powerful. You have better ideas, you have more physical health, more physical strength, more connection, relationship, more community, and everything just works better. So stillness first, I say, and then action guided by wisdom.
Beautiful. And Alexa, I think the last two answers also answer your question, so I won't repeat. Florence asks, is it possible to align a peaceful mind yet a troubled heart?
Oh, sure. If your mind is at peace, sometimes the heart goes first and the mind doesn't catch up. Like, I feel strangely calm about this thing that should be bothering me. But very often, the mind stays frantic. Like, question of peaceful mind, yet a troubled heart. So sometimes the mind can say, okay, I hear everything that Martha Beck just told me on the gathering room. And it makes sense up here, but I can't stop this from hurting. Okay? So the whole thing about space holding us, the part of you that can actually contain both mind and heart is that spaciousness, the luminous emptiness that is your essence. So if you can use this methodology that I've been talking about, and any mindfulness or meditation technology will do, sorry to keep recommending it, it happens to be the silver bullet. You may not have to use it, but if you do, it'll work. So you have to go outside mind and heart, or rather inside, deeply inside them, like look at them, watch them until you see them. Oh, there's what my mind is doing. It's very calm. There's what my heart's doing. It's screaming, no, 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 you're leaving me out. Don't. Just leave me here with your stupid intellectualizing. And then you say from outside, troubled, and stay with me, for I am not. I am space. I am the peace that passeth understanding. I am compassion itself, and not compassion incarnate. Compassion discarnate. I need no body. I permeate all things. And sweet, hurting heart, you hurt as long as you need to. I'm right here. I'm right here. If you do that long enough, the heart will join the mind in a space of peace. And that peace is its own kind of certainty. It will never abandon us. And we can always find it if we go looking. So I love you guys. Thank you for hanging in and coming back to see us again, even though we were gone for long times. I love seeing your faces. I love seeing your questions.
For me also. I also love those things.
We'll see you
next
soon.
week. Same time, same channel.
Yep.